Jesus, in this part of Mark's gospel, is predicting his death. And the disciples are, instead of paying attention to the Christ, discussing among themselves which one is the greatest. This behavior is outrageous. While Jesus is trying to focus them and us on the cross, his most loyal followers go right to, what's in it for me? And I think it's important to point out that they, like we who follow Jesus today, often miss the direction that he wants us to go. And instead, we wander off where our hearts lead us. And I think that the disciples selfishly argue amongst themselves about who is greatest here and again in chapter 10, because they do believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah who will save them. They're convinced, though, that his ministry will end in the deliverance from oppression of an evil empire, and when Jesus does go and bring about the kingdom as they think it should be, one of them, surely one of them, will get the vice presidential nomination. One of them will be chosen, lifted up to serve as Secretary of State. And others will undoubtedly be assigned places in Jesus' cabinet in order of their perceived greatness. Hence, they're arguing amongst themselves. They, like we, often live without even the faintest idea about what that kingdom and the positions of leadership and responsibility Christ will call us to look like. They, like we, live without the faintest idea of what discipleship and truly following the way of Jesus is like on a daily basis. They, like we, and especially we in this presidential season, here in one of the early primary states, expect our leaders and our Jesus to be a warrior king, bringing triumph over all evil, oppression, and injustice. Triumph that looks like a battle decisively won, our security clearly secured, all in our eyes made right with ourselves and the world around us. And instead, God does what God most often does, shows up where we least expect God to and surprises us. God's triumph involves a cross instead of a more conventional path to victory. And then Jesus teaches his disciples and you and me the true meaning of leadership. Leadership does not mean power but service, because power strangles life. Power strangles life and brings about a slow death. But service brings life even from death itself. And the measure of discipleship and servant leadership lies not with adults or the highly educated or the pollsters, but with children. Jesus emphasizes his vision of leadership by giving us the example of serving a child. I think this is important because unlike our society today, when in many households the children are the center by which the world revolves, running mom or dad's taxi to and fro, scheduling and overscheduling, that wasn't the way society acted during Jesus' day. And we value youth. We treasure exuberance found in the young. We change our physical bodies surgically and by the clothes we wear, by the cars we drive, by the adventures we go on to try and hold on to our youth. But in Jesus' time, children were the least important people in society. In ancient cultures, children had the status of slaves, and the law viewed them as little more than property. And their parents, well, actually only their fathers, had absolute authority over them. And people had lots of children. They had lots of children because they needed them to serve them and the family household and business and farm or whatever they did. And they needed lots of children to serve them in their elderly years, because the mortality rate during this time was 50% for children under the age of 16. Childhood was not pleasant in the ancient world. And today, from Mark's Gospel, we hear from Jesus. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And then he takes a little child and puts them in amongst them. And then he grabs a child and takes the child into his arms, and he says to the disciples, "Whoever welcomes me, and one such as this child, welcomes not only me, but the one who sent me." His challenge and his call to you and to me are for us to be servant leaders who welcome children and serve them in spite of how our society views them, in spite of how they were valued in ancient society, in our world today, and even here in our All Saints community. Unfortunately, in many corners of the world, children in church and society today often have little more status than they once did. And while the role and place of kids in worship varies, many prefer children to be seen and not heard. We even have a little bit of that here. I had a conversation this week with one of our families about eyes being rolled at rambunctious children and the parents bringing them to this house of God. Some only see children's place in worship to be when they are performing for us in a Christmas pageant. Or perhaps at 1 or 2 Sundays a year when we tolerate a youth Sunday. Or when they become old enough so that they can sit in the pew and follow along and be quiet and behave themselves. And Sunday school is sometimes a good excuse for excluding children from worship itself. And our kids and young adults get the message. They know when they're not authentically welcomed. And many think that the dramatic drop in church attendance and participation after confirmation is in part a reflection of the lack of interest invested in children, in welcoming and valuing them. And by doing that means that we have to abandon our sense of authority and our status, spending those things on kids and taking them seriously, taking seriously those with the least ability to repay us. Thankfully, Jesus valued and took children seriously, serving them in love. But the images even that we have are of Jesus with little children gathered around at his feet, smiling wide-eyed in freshly pressed church clothes. Jesus scooping one of the cherubs up into his arms. I've even seen this picture in Sunday school classrooms. No pressure on parents with that one. But the real picture of Jesus with children isn't postcard perfect. They would have been dirty and snotty-nosed and unwelcomed in most people's living rooms, let alone pulling them up onto your lap. Thankfully, Jesus welcomes them all and calls you and I to do the same. I think on some levels, children worry us, especially children who are vulnerable. because they make us feel vulnerable. And Jesus calls us to move beyond our vulnerability to our responsibility. But we tend to ignore those vulnerabilities in ourselves and overlook those that we find in God's blessed children. Because we feel uncomfortable. We feel ill-equipped to help. We're overwhelmed, and so we deny our responsibility to welcome and to value the most vulnerable. And friends, God's children are vulnerable. From baby Doe, found in Boston Harbor, we now know as Bella Bond, murdered. To those who suffer from the heroin epidemic in Wolfboro. To those children who suffer war and famine from Syria to the Sudan. And to the larger issues of poverty and homelessness impacting our kids here in Carroll County. It overwhelms us. And we just want to look or run the other way. Thankfully, Jesus gets this. He understands where we are at. He gets our fear and our flight mentality. Jesus himself is vulnerable. He's about to be turned over to his death. And in the midst of his vulnerability, he welcomes us into that, our own vulnerability, and asks us to consider, what does it mean to be a disciple? To be a disciple of the one whose career climaxes on a cross. What it means to acknowledge, welcoming, and valuing those folks that make us feel vulnerable. And he teaches us that the vulnerability of death that he invites you and I to is a death to our own self-importance. And a death made particular in terms of extending our hospitality and God's love to all of his beloved children. But just who was this child Jesus spoke about? Who are we as Christian disciples to serve? I think we know the answer to that. Jesus teaches us that we are to show hospitality to those who have the same social status of the child, the outcast, the sinner, the sick, and the feeble. We are to show hospitality to all of God's children, regardless of how easy they are to serve or how deeply they challenge our vulnerabilities. And we're to show hospitality to those who Jesus welcomes and makes clear that discipleship and servant leadership means serving all, regardless of their chronological age. He challenges us, I think, to share and practice what is probably the most challenging spiritual practice of them all, to love our neighbor. He challenges us to look around, not just in our heads, but in our daily lives, for someone concrete, tangible, a breathing child of God to invest our time and energy in. Someone who cannot possibly return the favor. And he challenges us all as children of God with all of our own vulnerabilities to receive others' ministry as well, since we're all little children in faith. Jesus brings a child into the midst of us this day, and by embracing that child, he invites us into his humble service. And that, my friends, beloveds, is how we get near to God. And that is also how God draws near to us. Because to serve one like children, to place all others at the same level as we place and see ourselves, is the way, is the truth, and is the life. the life of Jesus the Christ, made possible through the cross.